I never thought a Tuesday morning in February would turn my life into a legal battlefield. But that's exactly what happened when Brenda Morrison decided my idling diesel truck was a personal affront to her existence. The whole thing started on one of those brutal New England mornings where the cold seeps through every layer you're wearing. I'm talking about the kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze instantly and your breath come out in thick white clouds. It was 6:30 in the morning, and I was warming up my 2019 Ford F-350 in the driveway of my house in Westbrook, Connecticut. The temperature had dropped to -8 degrees overnight, and anyone who knows anything about diesel engines understands you don't just hop in and drive when it's that cold. You let them warm up. It's not optional. It's mechanical necessity. I had poured myself a cup of coffee and was standing in my kitchen, watching through the window as the exhaust from my truck created a small fog bank in my driveway. I own a heating oil delivery company called Sinclair Energy Solutions, and winter is my busy season. February in Connecticut means people need their tanks filled constantly, and I had 12 deliveries scheduled for that day alone. My truck needed to be ready to roll, which meant letting the engine warm up for at least 10 minutes before I loaded up the routes and headed out. That's when I saw her. Brenda Morrison, president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, marching across the street from her pristine colonial with her phone pressed to her ear. She was wearing a puffy white coat that made her look like an angry marshmallow, and her face was twisted into that particular expression of righteous fury that only an HOA president can truly master. I watched as she stopped at the end of my driveway, gesticulating wildly at my truck while talking animatedly into her phone. My stomach dropped. She wasn't just complaining to a neighbor. The way she kept pointing at my license plate and then at her watch told me exactly what was happening. She was calling the police. I set down my coffee mug and walked to my front door, pulling it open just as she noticed me. The cold air hit me like a physical blow, but I stepped out onto my porch anyway. "Brenda, what's going on?" I called out, trying to keep my tone neutral. She lowered her phone slightly, her eyes narrowing. "What's going on, Frank, is that you're violating Municipal Code 3.7a, which clearly states that no vehicle may idle for more than 3 minutes within residential zones. You've been running that monstrosity for at least 7 minutes, and the noise is absolutely unacceptable. It's a diesel engine in sub-zero temperatures," I said, keeping my voice level. "It needs to warm up properly or I'll damage the engine. I'll be leaving in just a few minutes." "The law is the law," she said, her voice sharp. "And yes, I'm reporting this to the police. Maybe a fine will teach you to be more considerate of your neighbors." I felt anger rising in my chest, but I forced it down. "Brenda, I've lived here for 6 years. I warm up my truck every winter morning. This has never been a problem before." "Well, it's a problem now," she snapped. "I was recently elected HOA president, and I take our community standards seriously. The noise ordinance violations, the commercial vehicle parking, your complete disregard for the aesthetic cohesion of our neighborhood, it all stops now. Commercial vehicle parking. This is my personal truck. I drive it to work. It has your company logo plastered across both doors," she said. "That makes it a commercial vehicle, and according to our HOA bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 4, commercial vehicles may not be parked in driveways overnight where they're visible from the street." "I'm not part of the HOA," I said flatly. "My house was built before Maple Ridge was established. I was grandfathered out of the association." Her face flushed red. "Your property may not be technically within the HOA boundaries, but you still have to follow municipal ordinances, and you absolutely are creating a public disturbance." Before I could respond, a Westbrook police cruiser turned onto our street. Brenda's face lit up with vindication as the car pulled up behind my truck. Officer Martinez stepped out, a guy I actually knew from the local diner where I grabbed breakfast sometimes. He looked tired and not particularly thrilled to be there. "Morning, Frank," he said, nodding to me before turning to Brenda. "Madam, you called about a noise complaint, an idling violation," Brenda corrected immediately. "Municipal Code 3.7a. He's been running that diesel truck for over 10 minutes now in direct violation of the 3-minute limit." Martinez looked at my truck, then at me, then at the thermometer mounted on my porch that clearly read -6 degrees. "Frank, how long have you been warming it up?" he asked. "About 8 minutes, I admitted. "It's a diesel. In this cold, the engine needs time to warm up properly, or I risk damaging the fuel system." Martinez nodded slowly. "I understand that, but technically, the ordinance does say 3 minutes. "That's ridiculous for diesel engines in this weather," I protested. "That law was written for regular gas engines. Diesel fuel can literally gel in these temperatures." "I'm just telling you what the law says," Martinez said, looking uncomfortable. "Look, I'm going to give you a warning this time. But you need to be aware that if we get another call, I'll have to issue a citation. The fine is $150. Brenda looked furious. "A warning? He's been doing this every morning for years, according to my neighbors. This is a pattern of behavior." "Madam, I'm handling this," Martinez said, his tone firm. "Frank, just be mindful of the time, okay? Maybe warm it up for 3 minutes, then drive slowly for the first mile or two. That should help." "That's not how diesel engines work," I said, but Martinez was already walking back to his cruiser. Brenda stood at the end of my driveway, her arms crossed. "This isn't over," she said. "I'll be monitoring your behavior very closely." "You do that," I said, and went back inside, slamming the door harder than necessary. The next morning, I tried to follow Martinez's advice. I started my truck and let it run for exactly 3 minutes, then climbed in and started driving toward my first delivery. Half a mile down the road, the engine started sputtering. The check engine light came on, and I barely managed to limp into a gas station parking lot before the truck died completely. 3 hours and $600 later, a mechanic had cleared the gelled fuel lines and replaced a damaged fuel filter. He shook his head when I explained what happened. "You can't do that with a diesel in this cold," he said. "These engines need proper warm-up time. 3 minutes isn't enough. You're looking at 10 to 15 minutes minimum when it's this cold." "I know," I said through gritted teeth. "But apparently the municipal code doesn't care about mechanical reality." I was behind schedule for the entire day, which meant angry customers and lost revenue. That night, I lay awake thinking about Brenda and her threat to keep monitoring me. I had a business to run. I couldn't afford to keep damaging my truck or falling behind on deliveries. The next morning, I set my alarm for 6 instead of 6:30. I started my truck, let it warm up properly for 12 minutes, and was pulling out of my driveway by 6:15. I thought the earlier time might help avoid any issues. I thought wrong. At 6:45, while I was in the middle of my second delivery of the day, my phone rang. It was Officer Martinez. "Frank, I've got another complaint from your neighbor about the idling truck," he said, sounding even more tired than before. I wasn't the responding officer this time. Officer Chen went out there, and since this is your second violation, she had to issue a citation. "I started earlier to avoid bothering anyone," I protested. "According to the complaint, you were idling for at least 10 minutes. The citation is for $150. You can contest it in court if you want, but I'm just giving you a heads up that this is now on record." After he hung up, I sat in my truck in someone's driveway, staring at the steering wheel. $150 might not sound like much, but it was the principle. I was following basic vehicle maintenance protocols in extreme weather, and Brenda was using municipal code as a weapon because she didn't like me. The citation arrived in the mail 3 days later. I stared at it for a long time, then looked at my delivery schedule. Brenda Morrison's name was right there, scheduled for a fill-up on Thursday. That's when the idea hit me. Brenda lived at 47 Maple Ridge Drive in one of the neighborhood's largest houses. According to my records, she had a 300-gallon heating oil tank that we filled approximately every 6 weeks during winter. Her last fill had been in early January, which meant she was probably sitting at around a quarter tank by now. With temperatures still hovering in the single digits and teens, she'd be needing that delivery soon. I pulled up her account history on my computer. She'd been a customer for 3 years, ever since she moved to Westbrook. Never late on payments, always scheduled her deliveries in advance like clockwork. A model customer, really. I picked up the phone and called her number. She answered on the second ring. Morrison residence. Hi, Brenda, this is Frank Sinclair from Sinclair Energy Solutions. I'm calling about your scheduled delivery for Thursday. Yes, I'm expecting that, she said, her tone immediately cooling when she recognized my voice. Is there a problem? Actually, I'm calling to inform you that we're going to have to cancel your service, effective immediately. Silence on the other end. Then, excuse me, I'm terminating our business relationship. You'll need to find another heating oil supplier. You can't do that, she sputtered. I have a scheduled delivery. I'm a paying customer. I absolutely can do that, I said calmly. We're a private business, and we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. There are at least 4 other heating oil companies in the area. I'm sure one of them will be happy to take you on as a customer. This is because of the police reports, she said, her voice rising. This is retaliation and it's illegal. It's not retaliation, it's a business decision. I've decided that the working relationship isn't beneficial for my company anymore. I'm within my rights. We'll see about that, she snapped and hung up. I sat back in my chair, feeling a grim satisfaction. Maybe it was petty. Maybe it was playing her game. But I was done being pushed around by someone who thought she could weaponize the law against me for doing my job. Thursday came and went with no delivery to Brenda's house. On Friday afternoon, she called again. I've contacted 4 different heating oil companies, she said without preamble. 3 of them are completely booked and can't take new customers until March. The 4th won't service Westbrook. That's rough, I said neutrally. Winter is a busy time. My tank is at a quarter full, she said, and I could hear the strain in her voice now. With these temperatures, I'll run out in less than 2 weeks. Then I'd suggest you keep calling around. There are companies in Hartford that service this area. This is unconscionable, she hissed. You're putting my family at risk over a personal grudge. I'm making a business decision. Just like you made a personal decision to call the police on me twice for warming up my truck in sub-zero weather. Actions have consequences, Brenda. She hung up again. I didn't feel good about it exactly. But I didn't feel bad either. She had gone out of her way to make my life difficult, to cost me money and stress, over something completely reasonable. Now, she was experiencing the natural consequences of alienating the person who provided an essential service to her household. The weekend was bitterly cold, with temperatures not rising above 10 degrees even during the day. On Sunday evening, my phone rang from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Frank Sinclair, speaking. This is Robert Morrison, Brenda's husband. I'm calling to ask you to reconsider canceling our service. I paused. I'd met Robert a few times at neighborhood gatherings before Brenda became HOA president. He was a quiet guy, an accountant who seemed perpetually exhausted. I'd always figured being married to Brenda was probably exhausting work. Robert, I appreciate the call, but my decision stands. Look, I know Brenda can be intense. I know she called the police on you, and I'm not saying you don't have a right to be angry, but we have 2 kids, Frank. 7 and 9 years old. If we run out of heating oil in this cold, they're the ones who'll suffer. That hit me harder than I wanted to admit. There are other companies. I've spent all weekend calling. Everyone's completely booked. There's a waiting list at 2 places, but the earliest either could possibly get to us is mid-March. Our tank will be empty long before then. He sighed heavily. I'm asking you, man to man, father to father, please don't punish my kids for my wife's behavior. I closed my eyes. Put Brenda on the phone. What? If she wants her service reinstated, she can ask me herself, and she can apologize for harassing me. There was a muffled conversation in the background, then Brenda's voice came on the line, tight with anger. My husband seems to think I need to beg for your services. I'm not interested in begging. I'm interested in an apology and an agreement that you'll leave me alone. Fine. I'm sorry I called the police. Are you happy? That's not an apology. That's you saying words because your husband told you to. What do you want from me? She exploded. You want me to grovel. You want me to admit that you can break the law whenever you feel like it. I want you to acknowledge that I wasn't doing anything unreasonable, that you used your position as HOA president to harass me over a petty grievance, and that you cost me time, money, and stress for no legitimate reason. I was enforcing community standards. You were being a bully. And until you can admit that, you can freeze. I hung up. My wife, Nancy, who had been listening to my side of the conversation from the kitchen, walked into the living room. That was harsh, she said. She's been harsh, I shot back. She called the cops on me twice. Cost me $600 in repairs and $150 in fines, not to mention the lost business from being behind schedule. I'm not defending her, Nancy said carefully, but there are kids involved, Frank. Kids who didn't do anything wrong. Their mother should have thought about that before she started this war. Nancy was quiet for a moment. When does this stop being about justice and start being about revenge? I didn't have a good answer for that. Monday morning, the temperature dropped to -12 degrees. I started my truck at 6:15, let it warm up for a full 15 minutes, and dared Brenda to call the cops. She didn't. Maybe she'd finally realized that pushing me further wasn't in her best interest. I completed my deliveries for the day, came home exhausted, and found Officer Martinez waiting in my driveway. We need to talk, he said. We went inside, and Nancy made coffee while Martinez sat at our kitchen table looking uncomfortable. Brenda Morrison filed a formal complaint against you, he said. She's claiming you're engaging in targeted harassment and discrimination by refusing to provide heating oil services to her family. That's nonsense, I said. I have the right to refuse service. You do, Martinez agreed. But given the prior history between you two, and given that heating oil is considered an essential service in winter, especially in these extreme temperatures, her complaint isn't completely without merit. If something happens to those kids because they lose heat, there could be legal ramifications. There are other companies. All booked solid, apparently. I checked. He took a sip of his coffee. Look, I'm not here in an official capacity. I'm here as someone who knows both of you and is trying to prevent this from escalating further. What you're doing is technically legal, but it's not a good look, Frank. And if those kids end up in danger, child services could get involved. That would be bad for everyone. I felt my resolve wavering. She needs to apologize. A real apology. I can't make her do that. But I can tell you that her husband is genuinely worried, and the school counselor has apparently already been notified because the kids have been talking about being scared of the house getting too cold. Nancy put her hand on my shoulder. Frank. I knew what she was saying without words. I was in the right, but I was also being stubborn to the point of cruelty. Those kids didn't deserve to be pawns in an adult conflict. Fine, I said finally. I'll restore her service. But I'm adding a surcharge for difficult customers, and I want it in writing that she agrees not to file any further complaints about my truck. I can't promise she'll agree to that, Martinez said. Then she can stay on a waiting list until March. Martinez left to talk to Brenda, and I sat at the kitchen table feeling hollowed out. Nancy sat down across from me. You did the right thing, she said. Did I? Because it feels like I just taught her that she can do whatever she wants and face no real consequences. You taught her that you're a better person than she is, Nancy said firmly. That matters. An hour later, Martinez called back. She's agreed to your terms. 20% surcharge, and a written agreement not to file complaints about your truck as long as you're following reasonable vehicle maintenance protocols. I witnessed the document, and it's legally binding. When does she need the delivery? As soon as possible. Her tank is at 18%. I scheduled her for Tuesday morning, my first delivery of the day. When I pulled up to 47 Maple Ridge Drive at 7:30, Brenda was waiting on her front porch despite the cold. She walked over as I was unwinding the delivery hose. Thank you for coming, she said stiffly. It's my job. I want you to know that I still think the idling ordinance is important, but I may have been overzealous in how I enforced it. It wasn't much of an apology, but it was something. And I want you to know that I'm going to keep warming up my truck properly, because that's what diesel engines require. But I'll try to do it as early as possible to minimize disturbance. She nodded curtly and went back inside. I completed the delivery, collected payment including the surcharge, and left. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong again. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. Despite the fact that my property wasn't technically within the HOA boundaries, they were filing a lawsuit claiming that my commercial activities and habitual noise violations were negatively impacting property values in the neighborhood and creating a public nuisance. I sat in a lawyer's office the next day, explaining the whole situation to a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in HOA disputes. This is harassment, she said after I finished. They're trying to bully you through legal fees and stress, even though they have no standing to sue you since you're not part of the HOA. Can they do that? Anyone can file a lawsuit. Whether they'll win is another matter entirely. But defending yourself will cost money, even if the case gets dismissed. She leaned back in her chair. How much do you want to fight this? However much it takes. I'm not letting Brenda Morrison drive me out of my own home. Good. Because I think we can not only get this dismissed, but potentially countersue for harassment and seek damages for your legal fees, the cost of the truck repairs, and the citation fees. Will that work? If we can establish a pattern of targeted harassment, yes. Do you have documentation of everything that's happened? I pulled out a folder I'd prepared with copies of the police reports, the citation, my truck repair bills, the agreement Martinez witnessed, and a timeline of every interaction I'd had with Brenda. Patricia smiled. This is perfect. I'll file our response and the countersuit. Be prepared for this to get ugly. She wasn't kidding. Over the next month, the legal battle intensified. The HOA's lawsuit claimed that my truck idling violated not just municipal code but also constituted a private nuisance under Connecticut common law. They brought in expert testimony from other residents about how the noise and exhaust affected their quality of life. Patricia deposed several of these residents. Under questioning, most of them admitted they'd never actually been disturbed by my truck until Brenda brought it to their attention. 2 of them admitted they were personal friends of Brenda's and wanted to support the HOA's position. Then, Patricia did something brilliant. She subpoenaed the HOA's meeting minutes and email records. What we discovered was damning. In an email chain between Brenda and 3 other HOA board members, Brenda had written, "Frank Sinclair needs to learn his place. He thinks he can ignore our standards just because his property predates the HOA. We need to make an example of him so other non-members don't get similar ideas." Another email, sent the day after I'd restored her heating oil service, read, "The idling issue may be resolved for now, but we can't let him think he won. I'm consulting with our lawyer about what other action we can take." Patricia presented these emails to the judge at our preliminary hearing. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Alina Foster, read them carefully, then looked at Brenda over her reading glasses. "Mrs. Morrison, these emails suggest that this lawsuit isn't actually about property values or public nuisance. They suggest this is personal retaliation against Mr. Sinclair for refusing to provide services to you." Brenda's lawyer, a nervous-looking man named Gerald Pierce, jumped in. "Your Honor, the HOA's concerns about community standards are legitimate regardless of the association's history with the defendant." "The defendant isn't part of your association," Judge Foster said flatly. "His property predates the HOA's establishment, and he has no legal obligation to follow HOA rules. The only jurisdiction you could possibly claim is municipal code, which is a matter for the police, not civil court. The private nuisance claim stands independent of HOA membership," Pierce argued. "A private nuisance requires substantial and unreasonable interference with the use and enjoyment of property. Warming up a vehicle for 10 to 15 minutes on cold mornings so it doesn't suffer mechanical damage doesn't meet that threshold, particularly when the activity occurs before 8 in the morning and ends when the plaintiff leaves for work." Judge Foster set down the papers. "I'm dismissing the HOA's lawsuit with prejudice. Furthermore, I'm granting Mr. Sinclair's request for legal fees and costs. Mrs. Morrison, the HOA will be responsible for paying Mr. Sinclair's attorney fees, which currently total $6,400. Brenda's face went white. "Your Honor, that's not fair. We were acting in good faith to protect our community." "Your own emails contradict that assertion. You were acting in bad faith to harass someone who refused to bow to pressure you had no right to apply." Judge Foster's expression was stern. "Consider this a warning. Homeowners associations exist to maintain communities, not to wage personal vendettas. If I see you in my courtroom again under similar circumstances, the penalties will be much more severe." Walking out of the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months. Patricia was grinning. "That went even better than I hoped," she said. $6,000 in attorney fees, plus I'll bill out the rest of my time and submit it for payment. You should end up ahead financially when all is said and done. What about the countersuit for the other damages?" "We can still pursue that separately, but honestly, I think you've won. The HOA has to pay your legal fees. Brenda Morrison has been publicly humiliated by a judge, and you've established a legal record that protects you from any future harassment. Sometimes the best victory is knowing when you've already won." I thought about that. She was probably right. The money would be nice, but what I really wanted was for Brenda to leave me alone. The judge's ruling had essentially guaranteed that. "Let's drop the additional countersuit," I said. "I just want this over." "You're a better person than most of my clients," Patricia said. That evening, Nancy and I celebrated with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine. We were halfway through dinner when there was a knock at the door. It was Robert Morrison. He looked exhausted and older than I remembered. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked. Nancy retreated to the kitchen, giving us privacy. Robert and I sat in the living room. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for all of this. I tried to get Brenda to drop the lawsuit, but she was convinced she was right. She doesn't handle being told no very well." I noticed. He gave a weak smile. "She's been removed as HOA president, emergency board meeting yesterday." The other members were furious that she'd cost the association $6,000 on a personal grudge. "They've asked me to tell you that the HOA officially withdraws any objection to your truck or your business." "That's good to hear. I'm also apologizing personally. I should have stood up to her earlier, should have stopped this before it got to court. But I've spent so many years just trying to keep the peace at home that I've gotten too good at looking the other way." He met my eyes. "That's not an excuse. It's just an explanation." "Robert, you don't have to apologize for your wife's actions." "Actually, I do, because I enabled them by not speaking up. That makes me complicit." He stood up. "Anyway, I just wanted you to know that some of us in the neighborhood appreciate what you do. And I'm sorry it took all this for me to say it." After he left, Nancy came back into the room. "That took guts," she said. "Yeah, more than I expected." The next morning, I started my truck at 6:15, let it warm up for 12 minutes, and drove off to make my deliveries without anyone calling the police. The winter gradually began to ease. By mid-March, temperatures were consistently above freezing, and my morning truck warm-ups dropped to just 5 or 6 minutes. Brenda Morrison kept her distance, though I occasionally saw her watching from her window as I left for work. I continued servicing her heating oil deliveries through the rest of the winter, charging the 20% surcharge each time. She paid without complaint. In late April, when the heating season was basically over, I received a check in the mail from the HOA's insurance company for the remaining damages we documented. The truck repairs, the citation fee, and compensation for the lost business that day I'd been stuck at the mechanic. Total, $1,200. Attached was a brief note on HOA letterhead. "Please accept our apologies for the actions taken by our former president. We value having you as a member of our community." It was signed by the new HOA president, a retired teacher named Martha Hughes who I'd spoken to exactly twice in 6 years and who had always been perfectly pleasant. I showed the check and note to Nancy. "You should frame that," she said, "as a reminder." "Of what?" "That standing your ground doesn't always mean you lose. Sometimes the bullies back down when you refuse to be bullied." She was right. I deposited the check, and life returned to normal, or as normal as it gets when you run a heating oil delivery business in New England. The following winter, I continued my routine of warming up my truck every morning. Nobody called the police. Nobody filed complaints. The world kept turning. Brenda Morrison remained a customer, though our interactions were limited to her signing the delivery receipt and returning to her house. The surcharge stayed in place. She paid it every time. In January of that second winter, I was making a delivery to a house 3 doors down from the Morrisons when Brenda walked over. I tensed, wondering what new complaint she'd invented. "I wanted to talk to you," she said. "Okay. I've been in therapy since last spring, working on some things." She looked uncomfortable. My therapist suggested I owe you a real apology, not the half-hearted one I gave before. I waited. I was wrong, she said, the words clearly difficult for her. I used my position in the HOA to target you, because I didn't like that you wouldn't follow rules I thought everyone should follow. I convinced myself I was protecting the community, but really, I was just being controlling and vindictive. I cost you money, stress, and time, and then I tried to use the legal system to punish you for standing up for yourself. That was wrong, I'm sorry. It was the most genuine thing I'd ever heard her say. Thank you, I said. I appreciate that. I also wanted to ask if you'd consider removing the surcharge. I understand if you won't, but I'm hoping we can move forward with a clean slate. I thought about it. The surcharge had been about making a point, and the point had been made. Keeping it now just felt petty. I'll remove it starting with your next delivery, I said. She nodded, looking relieved. Thank you. And for what it's worth, I am sorry about your truck. Robert explained to me how diesel engines work in cold weather. I didn't understand before. After she left, I finished my delivery and sat in the cab of my truck for a few minutes, thinking. People change. Not always and not easily, but sometimes they do. Brenda Morrison might never be someone I'd consider a friend, but she'd at least become someone who could admit when she was wrong. That was more than a lot of people managed. The rest of that winter passed quietly. My truck idled every morning without incident. I made my deliveries. Life was good. In early March, I received an invitation to speak at a small business owners meeting in Hartford about dealing with legal challenges. Apparently, word had spread about my case, and other small business owners were interested in hearing about how I'd successfully defended myself against an HOA lawsuit. I drove down to Hartford on a Tuesday evening and told my story to about 40 people gathered in a community center meeting room. Afterward, several people came up to share their own stories of dealing with aggressive HOAs, difficult customers, and the challenges of standing your ground as a small business owner. One man who ran a landscaping company shook my hand firmly. I've been dealing with an HOA that keeps trying to dictate how I can park my trucks and when I can load my equipment. After hearing your story, I'm going to push back. They don't have the right to control my business operations on my own property. Driving home that night, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. What had started as a frustrating conflict with a difficult neighbor had turned into something bigger. A reminder that standing up for yourself matters, even when it's hard, even when it costs something. The spring arrived properly in late April. The morning air lost its bite, and I no longer needed to warm up my truck for more than a minute or two. The neighborhood came alive with people working in their yards, kids playing outside, and the general bustle of a Connecticut suburb shaking off winter. I saw Brenda occasionally, usually working in her garden or loading groceries from her car. We'd wave to each other, a polite acknowledgement that while we'd never be close, we'd at least reached a place of mutual respect. One Saturday in May, I was washing my truck in the driveway when Robert Morrison walked over with his 2 kids. "Hey Frank, the kids wanted to ask you something," he said. The younger one, a girl about 7, looked up at me shyly. "Our class is doing a project about jobs people do, and I wanted to learn about delivering heating oil. Could I interview you?" I smiled. "Sure. What do you want to know?" For the next 20 minutes, I answered questions about how heating oil works, how I plan my delivery routes, what happens if someone runs out of oil in the middle of winter, and a dozen other things that I'd never thought about explaining to a 7-year-old. She took notes in a sparkly purple notebook, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on writing. When they left, Robert hung back for a moment. "Thanks for doing that, and thanks for giving us another chance. Not everyone would have." We all deserve second chances, I said. Some of us just take longer to earn them than others. That summer was busy in a different way than winter. I spent time maintaining my trucks, updating equipment, and preparing for the next heating season. Nancy and I took a week's vacation to Maine, our first real time off in 2 years. When September rolled around and the air started to cool, I felt ready for another winter. The first chilly morning in October, I started my truck and let it warm up for 5 minutes before heading out. Nobody complained. Nobody called the police. Life, as it turned out, was pretty good when people just left each other alone to do their jobs. The Maple Ridge Homeowners Association continued to function under Martha Hughes's leadership, focusing on actual community improvements rather than petty enforcement actions. They organized a neighborhood fall festival, established a community garden, and started a program to help elderly residents with yard work. Brenda served on the garden committee. She seemed genuinely invested in it, spending hours planning flower beds and organizing volunteer days. People who had avoided her during her presidency started warming up to her again. In November, the first real cold snap hit. I was warming up my truck one morning when Brenda pulled out of her driveway. She stopped next to me, rolling down her window. "Looks like winter's here for real," she said. "Yep, going to be a cold one according to the forecasts." She hesitated, then said, "I know I've said this before, but I really am grateful you kept servicing our account. A lot of people wouldn't have, and we'd have been in real trouble if you hadn't." "Water under the bridge," I said. She nodded and drove off. I finished warming up my truck and headed out for my first delivery of the day, watching the sun rise over the Connecticut landscape. The frost on the field sparkled in the early light, and my breath fogged in the cold air. There's something satisfying about doing honest work, about providing a service people actually need. Heating oil might not be glamorous, but it keeps people warm in the winter, and that matters. It matters enough that I'd been willing to fight for my right to do the job properly, without interference from people who didn't understand what they were talking about. The whole experience with Brenda and the HOA had taught me something important. Standing your ground doesn't mean being cruel, but it does mean refusing to be pushed around. There's a balance between being vindictive and being a doormat, and finding that balance is one of the hardest things we do as humans. I'd made mistakes during the conflict. Canceling Brenda's heating oil delivery had been harsh, even if it was legal. But I'd also done the right thing by restoring it when I understood the stakes. And pursuing the legal case against the HOA's harassment had been absolutely the right call. Sometimes you have to fight. Sometimes you have to compromise. Sometimes you have to accept an imperfect apology and move forward. Wisdom is knowing which situation calls for which response. The winter progressed, cold and demanding. I made my deliveries day after day, keeping people warm, keeping their homes safe. Every morning I started my truck and let it warm up properly. And every morning the neighborhood remained peaceful and quiet. In February, almost exactly 2 years after the whole thing started, I was making a delivery to a new customer when they asked me about the logo on my truck. "Sinclair Energy Solutions. How long have you been in business?" 18 years, I said. "Took over my father's company when he retired. Good local business. We need more of those." The customer signed the receipt. "I heard about you, actually. My neighbor told me you stood up to some crazy HOA president who was trying to shut you down." I smiled. "Word gets around, I guess. In small towns it does. Good for you for fighting back. Too many people just roll over when someone with a little authority starts throwing their weight around." After I left, I thought about that conversation. My reputation in the community was stronger now than it had been before the conflict. People respected that I'd stood my ground while still doing the right thing in the end. That reputation was worth more than the money I'd spent on legal fees, more than the stress of the fight itself. In March, I got a call from a reporter at the Hartford Courant who was writing a story about small business challenges in Connecticut. She'd heard about my case and wanted to interview me. The article ran in mid-March with the headline, "Local Business Owner Wins Fight Against HOA Overreach." It told the story fairly, including quotes from Patricia Chen about the legal issues involved, and even a quote from Brenda Morrison about how she'd learned from the experience and changed her approach to community involvement. The article ended with a quote from me. "Small business owners face enough legitimate challenges without being targeted by people with personal agendas. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. But you also have to know when to extend grace and move forward." Nancy cut out the article and put it on our refrigerator. "Look at you getting philosophical in your old age," she teased. "I'm 38. That's not old." "It's old enough to have learned a few things," she said, kissing my cheek. She was right about that. I had learned things. About business, about people, about myself. I'd learned that being right isn't enough if you're also being cruel. I'd learned that legal victories matter less than personal integrity. I'd learned that most people are capable of change if given the right motivation and opportunity. And I'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just living your life well, doing your work honestly, and refusing to let small-minded people make you small-minded too. The spring arrived again, bringing warmer weather and the end of heating season. I scheduled my annual maintenance on the trucks, updated my customer database, and prepared for the slower summer months. One warm evening in May, Nancy and I were sitting on our back deck watching the sunset when she said, "You ever regret how everything went down with Brenda?" I thought about it. Not really. I wish it hadn't been necessary, but I don't regret standing up for myself. And I think, in a weird way, the whole thing was good for everyone involved. How so? Brenda got forced into therapy and self-reflection. She's a better person now than she was. Robert found his voice and started setting boundaries. The HOA got better leadership and refocused on actual community building. And I learned that I can fight when I need to and still maintain my integrity. "When did you get so wise?" Nancy asked, but she was smiling. "I'm not wise. I'm just old enough to have made enough mistakes to learn from a few of them." The summer passed pleasantly. In August, Martha Hughes, the HOA president, stopped by to ask if I'd be willing to donate heating oil for a raffle fundraiser they were organizing to build a playground in the neighborhood common area. "We're trying to raise $15,000, she explained. "We thought a raffle for a free heating oil delivery might be a good prize for the fall drawing." "I can do that," I said. "How about 2 free deliveries instead of 1? That's about $1,000 worth of oil." Her face lit up. "That would be wonderful. Thank you, Frank." "On one condition," I added. "The raffle is open to everyone in the neighborhood, HOA members or not," she laughed. "Of course. We learned that lesson the hard way, didn't we? In October, they held the raffle drawing at the fall festival. Nancy and I attended, walking around the various booths selling crafts, food, and raffle tickets. Kids ran around playing games, and someone had set up a small stage where a local band was playing classic rock covers. Brenda Morrison was running the community garden booth, selling potted mums and explaining the garden's volunteer program to interested neighbors. When she saw me, she waved. "Frank, Nancy, good to see you." We chatted for a few minutes about the garden, the festival, and how the neighborhood had changed over the past couple of years. It was surprisingly normal, like talking to any other neighbor about any other topic. When the raffle drawing happened, the 2 free heating oil deliveries were won by an elderly couple named Henderson who lived on the far edge of the neighborhood. They were thrilled, and I promised to make sure they were scheduled for early deliveries once the cold weather hit. Driving home that evening, Nancy said, "That was actually nice, normal, like how neighborhood events should be." "Yeah," I agreed. "It was. That winter was my 19th in the heating oil business." The patterns were familiar now. The first cold snap in November, the desperate calls from people who'd waited too long to schedule deliveries, the brutal cold of January and February, the gradual warming in March and April. Every morning I started my truck and let it warm up properly. Every morning the neighborhood stayed quiet and peaceful. The routine that had once been the source of so much conflict was now just routine again, unremarkable and uncontroversial. I saw Brenda regularly throughout the winter, delivering heating oil to her house every 6 to 8 weeks depending on how cold it was. We'd exchange pleasantries, talk about the weather, and that was it. Normal customer interactions, nothing more and nothing less. In February, almost exactly 3 years after that first morning when she'd called the police on my idling truck, I was making a delivery to her house when one of her kids came running out. "Mr. Sinclair, Mr. Sinclair." I recognized her as the girl who'd interviewed me for her school project, now probably 10 years old. "Hey there. What's up? I got an on my project about your job. My teacher said it was really interesting and well-researched." "That's great. Congratulations." Brenda came out onto the porch smiling. She's very proud of it, still has it hanging in her room. The girl ran back inside, already onto whatever kids that age think about. Brenda came down to sign the delivery receipt. "Thank you for being kind to her," she said. "I know things between us were difficult for a while, but you never let that affect how you treated my kids. They're good kids. None of what happened was their fault." "No, it wasn't." She signed the receipt and handed it back. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't back down." I needed someone to stand up to me. I'd gotten used to people just doing what I wanted to avoid conflict, and it had made me into someone I didn't like very much. "We all have moments we're not proud of," I said. "What matters is what we do after," she nodded. "Take care, Frank." "You too, Brenda." I finished the delivery and drove off to my next stop, thinking about how strange life can be. 3 years ago, Brenda Morrison had been my antagonist, the person making my life miserable. Now she was just another customer, another person in the neighborhood trying to keep her family warm in winter. People are complicated. Conflicts are complicated. But sometimes, if everyone involved is willing to grow and change, even bad situations can transform into something better. That spring, Patricia Chen called me. "I'm teaching a seminar on HOA law at the University of Connecticut Law School," she said. "I'd like to use your case as an example if you're comfortable with that." "Sure. What would that involve?" "Mostly just me talking about it." "But I was wondering if you'd be willing to come speak to the class for 20 minutes or so. Give them the perspective of someone who lived through an HOA dispute, not just the legal theory." I agreed, and in April I found myself standing in front of 30 law students, telling them about idling trucks and heating oil deliveries, and how a neighborhood dispute had turned into a lawsuit. "The law is important," I told them. "But so is understanding that behind every case there are real people with real lives. The law can protect you, but it can also be used as a weapon. Your job as lawyers is to help your clients navigate that reality while maintaining their integrity." One student raised her hand. "Do you think the legal system worked in your case?" "Eventually, yes. But it was expensive and stressful, and most people don't have the resources to fight like I did." The fact that Brenda Morrison could afford to file a frivolous lawsuit and force me to defend myself is a problem with the system. I won because I could afford a good lawyer and because I had clear documentation of her harassment. A lot of people would have just given up. Another student asked, "Would you do anything differently?" I thought about that. Maybe. The thing with canceling her heating oil delivery was harsh, and it put kids at risk. That's something I regret, even though it was technically legal. If I had it to do over, I might have found a different way to push back. After the class, several students came up to talk to me further. One woman told me her parents had been driven out of their home by an aggressive HOA, and my case had helped her understand the legal issues involved. "Thank you for fighting," she said. "Not everyone does." Driving back to Westbrook, I thought about those words. Thank you for fighting. It was a strange thing to be thanked for, but also kind of wonderful. I hadn't been fighting for any grand principle, not really. I'd been fighting because someone was making my life difficult, and I was tired of it. But in fighting for myself, I'd apparently helped other people understand they could fight for themselves too. That summer, the neighborhood playground was completed. The HOA had raised enough money for a really nice setup. Multiple play structures, swings, a climbing wall, and even a small splash pad for hot summer days. They held a ribbon-cutting ceremony in June, and Martha Hughes invited me to cut the ribbon alongside the major donors who'd contributed to the project. "You donated those raffle prizes that helped us reach our fundraising goal," she said. "We wouldn't be here without community members like you." Standing there with the big scissors, surrounded by families and kids excited about the new playground, I felt genuinely good about being part of this community. Not because I'd won some legal battle, but because I'd stuck around and stayed involved even after things got difficult. That's what community means, really. Not just living near people, but being willing to engage with them, support them, and occasionally fight with them when necessary, all while remembering that you're going to keep living near each other after the fight is over. The playground opened, and kids flooded onto the equipment, their excited screams filling the warm summer air. I stood with Nancy, watching them play, and felt like everything had worked out the way it was supposed to. Life continued in its ordinary way. Summer turned to fall, fall to winter, winter to spring. I kept delivering heating oil, kept warming up my truck on cold mornings, kept living my life. Brenda Morrison remained a customer. The surcharge never came back. Our interactions stayed polite and professional. Sometimes I'd see her at neighborhood events, and we'd chat briefly about nothing in particular. 3 years after the lawsuit, 5 years after that first morning when she called the police, I was at the grocery store when I ran into her in the produce section. "Frank, hi," she said. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. I've been thinking about going back to work. I used to be in marketing before I had kids, and I'm considering starting a small consulting business. Do you have any advice about dealing with difficult clients?" I almost laughed at the irony, but I managed to keep a straight face. The most important thing is setting clear boundaries from the start. Make sure expectations are documented. And don't be afraid to fire clients who cross lines, but do it professionally and legally. That makes sense. She paused. "I'm asking you because you handled a very difficult client with a lot of grace, even when I probably didn't deserve it." "You're talking about yourself," I said. "I am, and I'm still learning from how you dealt with that situation. You stood your ground without being cruel, and you knew when to push and when to back off. That's a skill I'm still working on." "We're all still working on it," I said. "None of us gets it right all the time." We talked for a few more minutes about business basics, then went our separate ways. Later, telling Nancy about the conversation, I felt a sense of completion. The person who had made my life hell 5 years ago was now asking me for professional advice. That was either the strangest irony or the best evidence that people really can change. Probably both, Nancy said. The years continued to pass. My business stayed steady, with enough customers to keep me busy in winter and enough slow time in summer to enjoy life. Nancy and I celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary. We took a trip to Ireland, something we'd been talking about for years but never quite gotten around to doing. When we came back, Westbrook felt like home in a way it always had, but somehow more so now. The conflicts with Brenda, the lawsuit, all of it had forced me to really think about what this place meant to me. And what I'd realized was that it was worth fighting for, worth staying in even when things got difficult. The Maple Ridge neighborhood continued to evolve. New families moved in, kids grew up, people retired and moved away. The playground became a central gathering spot, always busy with children playing. The community garden flourished under Brenda's leadership, becoming a showcase of flowers and vegetables that drew admirers from across town. I kept delivering heating oil, warming up my truck every winter morning, and nobody ever called the police again. Sometimes I'd think about that first morning, standing in my kitchen watching Brenda march across the street with her phone to her ear, and I'd marvel at how much had changed. Or maybe how much hadn't changed, because I was still doing exactly what I'd been doing that morning, warming up my truck so I could do my job properly. The difference was that now everyone understood why that mattered. Or at least, they'd learned not to make it their problem. In the end, that's all anyone can ask for. To be left alone to do their work, to live their life, to warm up their damn truck on cold winter mornings without someone deciding it's a personal affront. And if someone does decide to make it their problem, well, I learned that sometimes you have to stand your ground. Sometimes you have to fight. But you also have to know when to show grace, when to back off, and when to let bygones be bygones. Life is complicated. People are complicated. Communities are complicated. But somehow, most of the time, we figure it out. We stumble through our conflicts, learn our lessons, and come out the other side changed in ways we couldn't have predicted. I'm still delivering heating oil in Westbrook, Connecticut. Still warming up my truck on cold mornings. Still living 3 houses down from Brenda Morrison, who is still not my friend but is no longer my enemy either. And you know what? That's perfectly fine with me. The story of my conflict with the HOA became one of those things people in town knew about but didn't talk about much anymore. It was just part of the neighborhood history, like the time someone's garage burned down or the year the water main broke and flooded 3 basements. Life moves on. Problems get solved or at least managed. And in the end, we're all just trying to keep warm in winter and get along with our neighbors well enough to enjoy living where we live. Sometimes that's harder than it should be. But it's always worth the effort.